Joining me now is Director of Threat Information for the Center for Security Policy, Kyle Shideler. Kyle, thanks for being here.
Liz, always a pleasure.
All right, first of all, like I said in the intro, credit where it's due. At least Hillary spoke about this at all, more than I can say for our president.
Well, sure, and all of that would be great if she hadn't already been Secretary of State. And we've already seen what she actually does when the opportunity to protect America arises. And the answer is she overthrows governments that are working with us to fight al-Qaeda and replaces them with Islamist groups, and then ships arms across the globe, including to Syria, where they fall into the hands of ISIS, who uses them to kill the very minorities that she says we need to protect.
Now
Sure, everything she said sounds great, but she does the exact opposite.
Would it be essentially 4 more years if Hillary were president, 4 more years of President Obama's policies? Because it sounded to me like the meat of her speech, she even gave a bulleted list, but it didn't sound like, in essence, it would be anything different than what President Obama's doing right now.
No, it's exactly what the current administration is doing. And, you know, referencing the internet, does Hillary Clinton honestly believe that people become terrorists because of the internet and not because of the individuals spreading an ideology who use the internet? The internet is merely a pathway to reaching people. It's the message which one spreads upon that path, which is important. And Hillary Clinton cannot and will not address it. And in fact, she doesn't want any of us to be able to address it either.
Right, and she, of course, used that line just as a way of invoking Donald Trump in her speech. Donald Trump's wall, taking a little jab at Republicans while she was laying out her terrorism strategy. Let's talk about these individuals, like you said, because it's certainly the individuals responsible for terrorism. It's the individuals reaching other individuals that causes the radicalization into these terrorists. So let's talk about the Brussels attack for a second. There are reports that are saying that these suspects, those who died and those who did not only were they tied to the Brussels attacks, they could have been tied to the Paris attacks, and it potentially could be a terror cell. Kyle, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's an extensive cell that was tied both to Paris and the Brussels attack. In fact, the 2 suicide bombers, the one who detonated himself at the airport and the one who detonated himself at the metro station, they were brothers. And in fact, Belgian police had raided their apartment looking for the mastermind of the Paris attack. Those 2 individuals were able to escape, remain in hiding, and then conduct this attack without the Belgian police being able to catch them. And that requires a network. That requires a large group of people assisting you and who aren't going to rat you out to law enforcement. And unfortunately, there's plenty of that very network throughout Belgium and really throughout Europe. And that's one of the things that, you know, Mrs. Clinton doesn't want to address. She doesn't want to address the wider networks of people that are necessary to recruit, train, indoctrinate, and protect the people who conduct the attacks.
How large do you expect this network to be? Law enforcement in a lot of European countries are talking about their expectation for another attack. Are they going to be able to thwart that, or is this network, are we just getting a glimpse, the tip of the iceberg, and looking at it?
Well, I know we've seen reports from intelligence officers that they expect as many as 400 individuals linked to ISIS having moved through Europe in order to conduct attacks like that. So, you know, clearly there's no shortage of recruits to conduct these attacks, and they're able to rely on the movement of weapons and goods. When they raided the apartment after the Brussels attack, they found explosives, large numbers of explosives, and the ability to create more. They found weapons, and they found an ISIS flag. And that's just one of many raids that have already been taking place. We have to remember that Belgian authorities have been raiding known and suspected Islamists and terrorists since the Paris attack for months now, and yet this cell was still able to conduct their attack. As I said, that suggests a wide network of people that are willing to protect you in these no-go zones, these areas that law enforcement is weak and unable to operate in. You know, we've seen reports in the news already. Belgian law enforcement is saying, you know, we can't go into these neighborhoods. We go in and nobody will talk to us. They're all afraid to talk to us, or they have contempt for us and they don't want to talk to us. And that's the kind of neighborhood that will eventually permit networks to operate in and attack. Yet when presidential candidate Ted Cruz talked about the importance of empowering law enforcement to operate in in these neighborhoods and to contact people and ask them about what's going on in their neighborhoods, he was soundly attacked by the left-wing media and by Mrs. Clinton. So if we actually want to address the situation that Mrs. Clinton addresses, we have to do something different from what the Belgians are doing. But what Mrs. Clinton proposes is essentially the Belgian model.
Right, because particularly in Europe, the lack of assimilation, like you were just mentioning, these neighborhoods that are culturally set apart from European neighborhoods, they become hotbeds not of terrorism themselves, but of turning a blind eye to terrorism. Because these individuals in these neighborhoods know the structure of the society, they know the geographical locations, they know the targets, and that's when the radicalized terrorists come into these predominantly Muslim neighborhoods and find out this information so that the terrorists can then conduct these attacks. I'm glad you brought up, Kyle, though, Ted Cruz's comment, because I wanted to ask you to clarify that for us. There's been a lot of outcry in the media from the left, even some on the right, about his comments. Explain that to us in a little more depth what he meant, because the sound of it, just patrolling Muslim neighborhoods, does sound like targeting a neighborhood based off of religion.
Sure. Well, one, of course, has to be aware that law enforcement patrols every neighborhood in this country. It's the responsibility of law enforcement to search for, detect, and prevent crime, including terrorism. And they should do that in every neighborhood. And, you know, Muslim neighborhoods should not be deprived of law enforcement or law enforcement assistance. And yet what we've seen repeatedly is that law enforcement relies on organizations that essentially are sympathetic to terrorism, organizations like CARE and other Islamist groups that tell Muslims in their neighborhoods to shut up and not talk to law enforcement when they're worried about terrorism taking place. And we saw this in 2009 in Minneapolis, where the Somali community was very worried about their children going to join al-Shabaab. And CARE came in and said, don't talk to the FBI, don't go to them for help. Well, we want our Muslim neighbors to be able to go to law enforcement and say, I'm worried about what's going on. And they shouldn't have to do that through an intermediary like CARE that acts as though they are the rulers and the determiners of what the Muslim neighborhood is and what they can and can't say to law enforcement.
Right, you're exactly right, Kyle, and we see that not just in the neighborhoods, we see that at the radicalized mosques, the mosques in our own country, in America, that have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Every individual that attends those mosques isn't a terrorist, isn't radicalized, but in order to attend those mosques, you do have to have knowledge of what happens, and no one says anything, because like you said, it's being dictated by organizations outside the United States. So I think you're right on point with that. Kyle, we are out of time for today, but I appreciate your insight on these topics, as always.